Hi there, this is the sticky note lecture for Chapter 5 in the Withcott and Brennan Environment Behind the Story 2nd edition. Alright, so starting out with Chapter 5, the title is Evolution, Biodiversity, and Population Ecology. And don't let the title throw you. We don't really talk very much about evolution, just a little bit about natural selection. The case study for this chapter is about some golden toads of Monteverde and how they discovered these toads in a Costa Rican rainforest, and then later they became extinct within, I believe it's something like 25 years. The book is kind of interesting because when this book was published in 2006, they attributed the decline in population to climate change. But in 2010, so 2 years ago, there was an article published that scientists found out that actually a pathogen killed the frogs. So it wasn't climate change like your book says, it was actually a pathogen. So that's a little update of information regarding the golden toads. The first thing that I want you to sticky note here on page 119 in your book is you need to know about natural selection, and there's a chart here at the bottom of page 119 that outlines the characteristics of natural selection. Organisms produce more offspring than can survive, individuals vary in their characteristics, etc. At the top of the page here is two definitions. You need to know adaptations and mutations for your test. Be aware that when we're talking about selection and a species that has a good trait, we say it's selected for and it survives. For example, if you're a bunny rabbit that lives out here in Santa Clarita and you've got kind of a light brown fur, that's a good trait because you're camouflaged against predators. So we say those bunnies are selected for. So bunnies with light brown fur are selected for in our environment. They survive. It's a good trait. But perhaps bunnies that have darker brown fur, perhaps they're not camouflaged as well, and so we say they're selected against because dark brown fur is a bad trait and those bunnies will die. Another term we use for this is that the dark brown fur is maladaptive to our particular ecosystem. Now there might be a different ecosystem in which dark brown fur is better, and maybe it's an area with more shade, a forest area, and in that case dark brown fur is selected for in a forest ecosystem. It's better. So, just to reiterate, an adaptation, something that helps you survive, might be good in one particular ecosystem, but bad in another ecosystem. On this page, make sure you know the 3 types of selection: directional, stabilizing, and disruptive. Don't forget that you can pause this video anytime you need to copy sticky notes. Turning the page to 122, we have here artificial selection. We have 2 examples up here. We have the dog breeds and the crops. And these are examples of artificial selection where humans have decided what traits they like in the dogs, or cattle, or horses, or lots of kinds of crops, and they breed the traits that they want together. And so we have created new varieties of animals and plants, and this is called artificial selection. And at the top of 122, we have the words biological diversity or biodiversity, which is the number of species in an area. The Earth is estimated that we hold 100 million species. Alright, so the next page talks about, well, how do species become new species? And Well, first going back to the definition of a species. If you can mate and produce babies, you're a species. Well, just to clarify that, if your offspring is also fertile, then you're a species. Because a horse and a donkey can mate and produce a mule, but the mule is infertile. A mule cannot reproduce. So horses and donkeys are considered separate species. So there's a lot of reasons why certain animals or plants or fungi or bacteria do not breed together. We don't need to memorize those reasons in this course, but just know that if you don't breed normally in wild and at a consistent basis, you are considered separate species. So how do separate species come about? Well, one of the theories is called Allopatric Speciation, which is also Geographic Isolation. And here we have an example of a squirrel that's kind of a medium brown color living in all of these areas, living in this entire area. Then a flood moves in and isolates two separate populations of the same squirrel. Over time, many years, perhaps lighter fur is selected for on this island for whatever reason. Maybe darker fur is selected for on this island. Maybe there's more shade. And then maybe the waters recede, they go down, and all of a sudden these squirrels are not isolated anymore. They can mix with each other. But if they no longer breed together, they are considered now separate species. So when before they were all one species, breeding all together, now they're considered separate species and they do not breed together. On page 124, there's several mechanisms that can cause this geographic isolation, from rivers changing course to sea levels rising to climates drying, ocean pattern currents shifting. Make sure you can write about 2 or 3 from this chart. You do not have to memorize this whole chart, but make sure you can understand and be able to write about on a test question 2 to 3. Another type of speciation is called sympatric speciation. This occurs mainly in plants because plants can asexually reproduce a lot, which means that they can send out a runner, which is a clone of itself, and create a new little tree or a new little bush from the old bush, and it didn't need a flower to do that. Flowers are part of sexual reproduction, where you have a mixing of genes and creates seeds. Some plants can reproduce without this. They just, again, send a little runner out to start a new plant. Those plants are clones of each other. So sympatric speciation occurs when there's a mutation in the mother plant, and this plant then can no longer reproduce because of this mutation. They can no longer sexually reproduce with its own kind. But it can send out runners to create more of itself, and the daughters, maybe this mother plant sends out 10 runners, and we call them daughter plants. And those daughter plants can then send out more runners and create more, and then eventually they can seed and then sexually reproduce with themselves, with each other, and eventually become a new species. And so we consider that sympatric speciation. That doesn't happen in the animal kingdom for the most part, because most of the animal kingdom does not do asexual reproduction. If you have a mutation and let's say there's a bird that has a mutation and it can no longer sexually reproduce with some other bird of its own kind, it just dies out. And that mutation does not get passed to any other, to its offspring. That's the animal kingdom that does sexual reproduction. If you have a mutation again, you just die off. If you have a mutation that prevents reproduction, you just take that mutation to the grave with you. But in in an organism that can asexually reproduce and create clones, those clones can then later sexually reproduce and create a new species that way. I hope that's clear. Please send me an email if it's not, and I'll go over it. That's the end of part 1. We'll finish the chapter in part 2.